Yes, a citizen's veto is feasible. Addressing concerns about the citizen's veto being a pipe dream. This will be the provision of the 1984 No More agenda that most people have an issue with. We can understand that. It is not an unreasonable position. We had similar concerns when formulating this plan. The logistics of doing secure electronic voting will be a large part of that skepticism. We address that in a separate section covering the open source voting methodology that you can watch in the video titled How to Construct a Secure, Accurate, and Convenient Voting System. The simple message of that video is that you can make remote voting more secure and more convenient than the current voting systems with the proper protocol. Now let's examine some of the other common objections. Objection 1, direct democracy is a bad idea. One objection you will get is that direct democracy is bad. This is an accurate sentiment. A good quote illustrating the point is from James Bovard, who stated, "Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Liberty is a well-armed sheep protesting the vote." The response to this objection is 1984 No More is not direct democracy at all, and this system better upholds the ideals of a Republican form of government. Under this proposal, citizens just cannot propose a bill to give everyone a $100,000 check. Legislators, not citizens, will be drafting and proposing laws just as in the status quo. And let's just say these legislators have not exactly done a great job the last 20 years of protecting the rights of minorities. Politicians in Europe recently have gone as far as breaking the Nuremberg Code to implement vaccine passports for vaccines that never completed proper long-term clinical trials. In contrast, the 1984 No More agenda has added more checks on the legislature itself to prevent such violations from happening. This is necessary as small groups of people who need a lot of money just to get elected are much more likely to be bribed by special interests like vaccine manufacturers than an entire country not beholden to those special interests. The check the president was supposed to have on the legislature through the veto has to be returned to the people. No person should have that much power, especially as it provides too great a target for influence peddling. A citizen's legislature or a citizen's veto are the only ways to insulate a society from the influence of wealthy lobbyists, both domestic and foreign. Less than 250 people is all the people you need to bribe or blackmail to change the entire course of a nation. It is all you need to bribe to get corporate welfare. Give me a $5 million contract, and I will kick you back $1 billion. It is a win-win scenario. And you cannot stop bribes with legislation because most bribes will be perfectly legal due to the principle of plausible deniability associated with outside income streams. See why laws will never eliminate undue influence on legislators. Wealth should never gain you power over the people. By distributing power back to the people with a citizen's line item veto, it will be really hard to pass corporate welfare and special interest projects. The main check on democracy in real life is the rule of law. Constitutional standards on the limits of governmental power, protecting the rights of the people. With jury nullification becoming a forgotten concept in the United States and legislators treating the Constitution like a suggestion not organic law, judges have been the only realistic check on government power. The courts definitely have done a lot of good putting some restrictions on the government, but have also let a lot of bad laws get through. The preemptory challenge provision precisely brings back the rule of law to the government, better protecting the rights of minorities as a republic should do. And, people of good intent will be a better judge of whether laws are constitutional or not than those who owe their power and chance of future advancement to those that appointed them. Judges who rule against the government establishment are not likely to be promoted to the Supreme Court. Additionally, we should not have to wait years for a remedy if unconstitutional rules are passed. See preemptive legal challenges judged by common citizen juries on all legislation and executive orders that affect public policy for more on how this provision preserves the rule of law in a republic. So, taken as whole, the agenda better protects the rights of the minority from that of the majority. What we stop is the tiny minority of the elite getting carte blanche to rule over the masses through influence peddling. Objection 2, citizens will bust the budget. The idea here is that under a citizen's veto, people will just vote for all the handouts to the citizens and reject all taxes. This is the most compelling concern, and there is a way to solve this problem which is discussed in the video titled Median-Based Budgeting with a Unified Tax Offset, which should be below this video on the website. This budgeting methodology takes away the incentive to just vote yourself goodies and actually should have the effect of decreasing government spending instead of sending the government on a giant money printing spree. Objection 3, no one has the time to vote for all the items on the ballot. This is a very reasonable concern. Who is going to take the time to vote on all of these bills? The answer is it can be as slow or quick as the person wants it to be. The way we envision this working for most people is we have open source voting software that allows one to import voting files from other people that the person trusts that can be used to vote in bulk. Essentially, people without the time to figure out everything, which will be most people, will outsource their vote to one or more representatives. This is a lot like what happens when we elect representatives, which most people do not have a problem with. The difference is you can choose anyone. A friend, someone in your family, a college buddy, a writer you respect, a politician, a judge, and think tanks that align with your point of view all represent potential sources of voting files. You are not limited by geography and those who have the money and connections to run for office with a reasonable chance of winning. Therefore, you have a much greater choice of who to delegate that authority to if you chose to do so. Essentially, this becomes anything from a person spending time voting on every line item to a person choosing a much better form of representation by choosing amongst the best people to take recommendations from. The choice is in the hands of the voter, and that is a good thing. You can develop a lot of different algorithms for doing this in the software, which the user can choose. You can match people to a database of thought leaders based on political profiles everyone including the voter fills out. This would work much like how a dating site like Match.com matches compatible people. The voter can weight which issues are more important to him in determining a match. The sky is the limit. You are only limited by your imagination on how to improve the process. Entire industries could be created out of this, creating more scrutiny on legislation than has ever been seen in human history. Here is how it might work. To decide on social issues, someone might want to download digitally signed files from 5 public figures she agrees with on that topic and then have the software apply it to the ballot, flagging all the issues they disagree on. She can then decide those herself. Then she might choose another 7 people she wants to examine on economic issues and apply that to the laws tagged as economic issues. Then she might choose to download the list of the laws that were closest to being turned down based on the citizens' legislature that she had not already individually decided. These are obviously the most controversial by the people who looked at them. After that, she will go through any issues she knows from the news and opinion pieces that are on the ballot she wants to vote a certain way on, and then vote on those. The latest vote always overwrites what came before. Finally, she might have the system do a random review of laws just to make sure the profiles she chose really are matching her views, and if she finds an area of concern, she does a further review. That is how you can make a very well-informed vote without spending time reading every line of every single bill. On the other hand, someone who is not as diligent could literally take a file from their friend who always agrees with them and use it, and then go directly to the issues they know are in the news, and they care about. Technology and crowdsource knowledge will solve the logistics objection, and the result is demonstrably better than the status quo where the public gets no say at all in the final legislative product. Objection 4, people are too stupid to vote themselves. This is a very elitist attitude. A lot of people actually believe this in the corridors of power. They think they have the right to rule over the dumb masses. I can tell you from living and working with members of the segments of society that think this way on Wall Street, people would be utterly shocked at how completely incompetent people at the top often are. Some indeed are very intelligent and competent, but that is not the norm. The ability to kiss ass and play politics is often more rewarded than competence. And common sense is quite rare even among the intelligent. Have you ever sat down and spoken with your congressman? Many of these people are literally talking heads, elected because they have a combination of the right connections and charisma. A lot of them literally take their marching orders from elite think tanks, lobbyists, and political party bosses as votes are whipped up. This is evident in many of the laws that are passed. Some are just plain stupid, and others are just tone deaf to the way people who do not have tons of money actually live their lives. Normal people have something most of these people will never have, common sense. An example of elite legislator stupidity. Let me give you an example. In Paraguay, one of the poorest countries in South America, the elite passed this mandatory plastic bag fee law. I call it the bag tax, because any fee mandated by the government I consider a tax, even if paid to a corporation. If you went to a grocery store and wanted a bag before this aspect of the law went into effect, the grocery store gave you a plastic bag at no charge. Now the government is making people pay large grocery corporations extra for using a plastic bag at a grocery store. If a grocery store did this on their own, people would literally stop shopping there. But the government is mandating it, and I am sure the grocery stores did not object to all the extra money coming their way. This is essentially a tax on the poor, paid to rich corporations. And Paraguay is one of the poorest countries in South America. You do not implement a much more regressive tax than this. Presumably this was to lower plastic bag usage so landfills do not get filled with non-biodegradable plastic. This is a laudable goal. Indeed, if you read the text of Law 5414-15, there is a lot to like in the language. The problem is too much authority was delegated to bureaucrats without specifics, and the result was the people became the major targets of the legislation and not the big companies flooding the stores with plastics. 7 years later, the law barely makes a dent in the problem while increasing the expense and inconvenience to every citizen who is not using a maid to shop for their groceries. What is most annoying is that if you do not directly tell the cashiers to give you a bag and they forget to ask you to ring it up on the bill, as they often do, you could be stuck carrying a bunch of crap in your arms out of the store. And I am sure every person this happens to is then wanting to know the names of the control freaks who burden the people with this farce. Practically no one is bringing a reusable bag to the store. Even when the stores put out special lines for the bagless before the bag tax went into effect, those were predictably empty. The majority of people were never on board with this meddling of government into their shopping experience because politicians wanted to virtue signal. But more importantly, if you look around the store, they are using tons of plastic all over the place. This law barely makes a dent in the problem. Corporations that are getting the extra money from the bag tax are literally putting out milk in sealed plastic bags like this instead of the old-style biodegradable cardboard cartons. These are produced by Paraguayan companies. They represent a horrible customer experience because they cannot be resealed. And there are many who have alleged negative health consequences from packaging liquids in plastics that can leach hormone mimics into the milk you consume. This type of legislation is classic virtue signaling with elites who have no common sense, claiming to want to reduce pollution by letting poor people pay money to corporations while they let them continue to get away with using tons of plastic everywhere throughout the store. Why should the citizens be bearing most of the burden when they are not the ones choosing to give consumers plastic bags and plastic packaging? If plastic is a problem, why not start with the biggest offenders instead of making life more difficult for the average Paraguayan? Of course, it is not the citizens paying the legislators tons of campaign contributions to keep from being financially impacted by the law. A law that was passed 7 years ago, and yet you still see these stores covered in plastic. If they wanted to really impact things, they could have mandated milk cartons instead of the plastic bags they put the milk in. Or they could have mandated biodegradable paper bags that all the grocery stores used 40 years ago. What a concept! This literally was standard not so long ago. You do not need to research new forms of biodegradable plastic to implement such common sense reforms. More importantly, there would be no extra money paid by the poorest people in society. Replacing plastic bags with biodegradable paper also does much more to solve the problem than just reducing bag use by annoying grocery store customers through some bag tax. Either we have an actual problem with plastic waste and the government should solve it by mandating producers use paper and cardboard instead of plastic, or there is no problem and you should not inconvenience consumers by telling them they cannot have plastic bags, when stores do not even offer them paper bags. If the stores can throw out as much plastic as possible, then don't talk down to us about how we need to change the way we live our lives. And if they say we have to incrementally change, why is it they start with we the people first and not their corporate campaign contributors? It is like some heartless inhuman machine came up with this law, one that only care about campaign donors and external NGOs and not the average citizen. The people of Paraguay should also know current presidential candidate Arnaldo Wiens was the primary sponsor of this bill, as you can see from the article here. So, people should ask him on the campaign trail why he sponsored a bill that is now responsible for making normal people pay corporations extra money instead of forcing grocery stores to use paper bags like they had no trouble doing back in the 1980s. Why 7 years after this bill has passed are we still being served milk in sealed plastic bags from Paraguayan companies if this bill was supposed to reduce plastic use? This shows a fundamental lack of intelligence and common sense by the people making these laws. If you want to solve a problem, you go to the source of the problem, not your voters who are talked down to and thrown under the bus. The people who pass this probably never even shop themselves. And what is worse, is this is being pushed by a bunch of foreign non-governmental organizations as part of UN Agenda 2030, the same agenda forcing farmers off their farms in Amsterdam. No, we should trust the people a heck of a lot more than these elite fools. Speaking of UN Agenda 2030, we need to discuss the biggest scam of all from the so-called elite. The prospect that carbon dioxide, better known as life-giving air for plants, is somehow a pollutant. Like water and oxygen, there is nothing more natural and life-giving than carbon dioxide. Water is actually a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. This is the reason the temperature drops so fast at night in deserts. But they could never get away with saying we need to cut back on water vapor produced in the same combustion reactions that produce carbon dioxide. No one is stupid enough to buy that water is toxic when they drink it every day, but it is in fact a bigger contributor to the greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide. But more importantly, you have to ask yourself, why is global warming bad? It is ice ages that are the biggest dangers to humanity. The most prosperous times are those like the medieval warm period, and crops yields in Europe multiplied by a factor of 3 and people lived as much as 2 decades longer. One narrative that has been promoted by the cult demonizing carbon dioxide is that the environment is so unstable that if we get too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and it becomes too warm, there will be a self-reinforcing effect that will spiral out of control until the planet is a lifeless greenhouse like Venus. There is one big problem with this. That whole narrative is empirically denied by actual science. Carbon dioxide levels and temperatures have both been much higher on this planet, and we are still here. This is a page from the NOAA website that admits carbon dioxide levels were between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million during the early Eocene period, well in excess of the 421 parts per million today. Temperatures were 9 to 14 degrees centigrade higher. This was not caused by humans but natural volcanic activity. The world did not end. And far from spiraling out of control, those levels came back down during subsequent eras. We have much more pressing environmental concerns than carbon dioxide, like toxic chemicals like PFAS from the aforementioned plastic products that are being found in mother's breast milk. Do you realize how much money companies like Goldman Sachs will make from setting up carbon tax exchanges? Follow the money and you will see where the science comes from. Large companies will not reduce their pollutants, they will pay private companies for the privilege of emitting carbon, money they can pay and their smaller competitors cannot. Like with the plastic bag regulations, the bulk of the burden will fall on the middle class and poor that cannot afford to pay the carbon taxes. Prices of fuel and heating will go through the roof. Those selling carbon credits will get rich. Those making a market in carbon credits will get rich. The people will suffer. That is the only reasons governments are promoting this. Meanwhile, they let real environmental dangers go unnoticed. For example, one environmental issue the politicians will not address is that companies like Monsanto have genetically engineered corn kernels to produce insecticides in the kernels themselves. That means you cannot wash off the pesticides, they are in every kernel you eat. Most of the corn manufactured in North America is the genetically engineered Bt corn. This was without anyone doing any evidence-based medicine to show this toxin was safe for human consumption, and many studies that would indicate there is a real danger. My point is, the biggest actual dangers from industrial pollution are ignored because there are lobbyists controlling legislators. How can citizens not beholden to them do worse? Might they hold companies instead of shoppers accountable for plastics? Might they focus on the safety of Bt corn before letting it be consumed by millions untested? Instead, our leaders are too busy worried about one of the most natural products in existence, carbon dioxide. Indeed, much of the energy problems in Europe at this moment stem from the suicidal Paris Climate Accord. World leaders pay homage to resulting from the paranoia around carbon dioxide. Look at Europe right now. Governments literally are committing suicide by implementing massive economic sanctions on Russia. They implement the sanctions, steal hundreds of billions in Russian money in the greatest theft in the history of mankind, and then criticize Russia for using oil to blackmail them? Germany literally has no good alternative to Russian natural gas to power their economy. Even if they could replace it all with liquid natural gas, that will be much more expensive because it is more expensive to transport than pipeline gas. This literally is national economic suicide because the governments in Europe care more about virtue signaling support for a government that outlawed opposition parties and jailed opposition leaders before the war ever started. And that got much worse after the war began, with Zelensky doing everything the West accuses Putin of, in terms of crushing dissent and worse. A country that provoked the war by bombing the crap out of Russian-speaking civilians in Donetsk and Luhansk. Ask any of these leaders in Europe the difference between what Putin is doing in the Ukraine to protect the persecuted Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass and what their NATO alliance did to Yugoslavia in the defense of ethnic minorities there. They will not be able to, because the same legal standard is being used. That does not justify either war, but these people are hypocrites invading countries all around the world like Libya, Iraq, and Yugoslavia, and then acting it is like the end of the world when the most corrupt nation in Europe does everything to poke the bear, including threatening to put nuclear weapons on its border and murdering Russian-speaking populations, and is invaded. And these European nations are willing to sacrifice the lives of their citizens for virtue signaling in a way that will not make a bit of difference to the war. Russia is going to win because they have more resources and consider the West moving NATO weapons to the Ukraine an existential threat on their border, just like the United States considered the Soviets in Cuba an existential threat during the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of these leaders should be staying out of it and promoting a peace agreement instead of fighting a proxy war with Russia down to the very last Ukrainian. The citizens cannot do worse than their current leaders. No matter how much one-sided war propaganda is broadcast in Europe, I doubt the citizens would vote for these sanctions when they understand the ramifications to their pocketbooks. That makes them smarter than all of the so-called elite in their houses of government. Elite that make so much off lobbyists they do not have to worry about the full brunt of the inflation like the elites that have their maids shopping at the grocery stores. Finally, most people will not be deciding everything themselves using the vote template method outlined above. Most will consult others who do understand complex issues, probably better than most elected representatives. But they will consult people that share their worldview and hopefully common sense. Then on the issues they care about most, they will probably vote on those items individually. Those will probably be the same issues that motivated their choice for representatives, that is if they had a choice, since often both sides of the political aisle share the same position. Ask Europeans where they can find a pro-peace representative right now. There are only neoconservative and neoliberal warmongers pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. A citizen's veto is practical, and it is a practice whose time is long overdue.